Well, good evening. It's nice to be back here in Brighton. I used to live up the road a ways from here in the mid-1970s, so it's kind of nice to find myself back in the stretch of the world. Sort of congenial to me. So as you've already heard, the talk tonight, goodness, this is the second time I've given it, and it is, I will warn you from the outset that it may not fully cohere. You should definitely interpret this as being in the nature of a mood piece. And the specific mood, though you will probably not believe this for a full 7/8 of its duration, the specific mood we're after is optimism. And the optimism is I found myself, you know, in a weird place in my career a couple of years ago. I'd written a couple of books. They were received very generously. I had been involved with information technology, networked informatics, urban informatics for quite a while. And one by one, all of the utopian dreams and aspirations that we had for this technology, I saw falling by the wayside. I saw, if anything, the world becoming ever crueler, ever coarser. All of the hopes that we had invested in the ability of people to coordinate through the use of these technologies, I won't say they were all dashed, because there were some very interesting things that happened that nobody could anticipate. And here I'm thinking of the Arab Spring and things of this nature, the M15 movement to Occupy. But for the most part, the world just seemed to be ever more commercial and drabber and less interesting to me. So I began looking for reasons for optimism. And I found, generally speaking, two kinds of optimism out there. There was the very brash American sort of optimism of people who are kind of paid to convince you that the best is yet to come. People who are here to tell you that technology was going to save the world and make us all transcendent, fabulous, glittering creatures. And I wasn't interested in that kind of optimism. I found it insultingly reductionist and sort of ahistorical and apolitical and just shallow. Another kind of optimism that I did encounter, it was an optimism based on hope. And I had the greatest sympathy for the people who had this, expressed this sort of feeling. But they didn't seem to be basing that optimism on anything perceptible about the real world. There was a slippage between this optimism and the things that we could see in the world around us on an everyday basis. So I am kind of a hardcore reality principle kind of a guy. I like to root my feelings wherever possible in sort of something empirical, something detectable about the world. So I began looking for a basement or a foundation or a floor to build my optimism on. And that's what this talk is about. It begins with an astonishing film I saw not too long ago, Bela Tarr's The Turin Horse, which, how many people here have seen the film? Okay, that's fantastic. So a couple of you. It is a bleak and an unremitting film from a filmmaker who is not known for his cheerfulness to begin with. It is a 2.5-hour long black and white film that starts with an epigram about an incident from the life of Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche, as is fairly well known, in the last 10 years of his life, the last conscious and coherent moment of his life was when he was on vacation in Turin. He was apparently on the last day of his vacation in Turin. He saw a horse being whipped by its driver, and he immediately collapsed with his arms around the neck of the horse, trying to comfort and soothe the horse. Such was his compassion for it. He immediately lapsed into a hebephrenic withdrawal from the world, which he occupied for the last 10 years of his life. He expired in the care of his mother and his sisters, one of whose his sisters kind of kidnapped and hijacked his legacy and prepared the way for Nazism with it in some sense. But the film opens with this very kind of mordantly funny quotation. It says, "We know that this happened to Nietzsche. What we do not know is what happened to the horse." We start with this astonishing 7-minute sequence in which the horse is driven across the landscape. Now, interestingly enough, the horse is, in the title, is posited as being Turinese. The landscape across which we now proceed is Hungarian, Middle European in some undefinable way. And we proceed in a frenzy across a howling void, across an immensity of nothingness, with the horse frothing and being whipped ever harder by its drover, until eventually he turns up in his sort of miserable peasant cavern, which he shares with his adult daughter. They're the only two people who live there. This is their cabin. The existence that they pursue in this cabin over the next 6 days, for that is the time span over which the film takes place, is deeply cyclical. Basically all you hear on the soundtrack for stretches of entire minutes is like the kind of howling of the wind. And I think it's a deliberate decision by the filmmaker. It's rather easy to tell. I mean, the film is produced gorgeously with an immense attention to detail in terms of, I mean, like, this cabin was fabricated for the film. But in the soundtrack, you can tell that the wind is a sound loop. It's actually, you can kind of hear where it starts over again. And given the craft with which the rest of the film is put together, you have to conclude that this is a deliberate choice on Tar's part. And cyclical is the nature of life between the man and his daughter in the cabin. Every day the same thing happens. Every day she gets painstakingly dressed and heads off in through the blasted landscape to the well to gather water. She returns to the cabin and boils a truly miserable meal of potatoes, which is all you see them to eat. They boil these potatoes, and the old man is lame and kind of, you know, he doesn't have the use of his right arm, so he kind of smashes the potato with his left hand, his claw-like hand, and he smashes some of it into his mouth and leaves most of it behind on the table, untouched. And then, you know, this is how their lives go on. You know, she kind of cares for him, but it's a very bleak existence, very unremitting existence, and you realize that this is sort of the entirety of his life world. But then, about midway through the film, something happens. The daughter is, I guess, washing the one dish when she looks through the window and sees out at the well that some strangers have arrived, and they are interfering with the well. Whether they are gypsies or other is never clearly defined, but they are not welcomed by the daughter at all. As a matter of fact, she goes out to remonstrate with them. They immediately start mocking her. They make life very uncomfortable for her. The father comes out with an axe in his hand to defend her and winds up chasing the strangers off. And you assume that all is going to go back to the cycle, to the life of the man and his daughter. But what happens, you realize in the aftermath of the visitors being chased away, is that something in the nature of a curse has been passed down upon the man and his daughter. The horse, which is their only source of income, refuses to eat and begins to withdraw from the world itself. The next day, when the daughter goes back to the well for the water, she finds the well dry. And very slowly, the systems of the world start to shut down. Even as already bare and basic and unremitting as this life in the cabin was, there's still a basement through which it can fall and a floor through which it can drop. The man and his daughter abandon the cabin. They pile their very few belongings onto the horse cart. They very painstakingly kind of whip the horse into motion. When the horse doesn't really respond to this at all, they just drag the cart themselves. They take the road, and there's a very beautiful extended sequence in which they go up the road and they turn a corner and they disappear, and you think, okay, well, you know, they've found some kind of safety or some kind of solace. But then, you know, as if you already knew that this was coming, a minute or two pass with nothing much happening on the screen, and then the cart reappears on the horizon, and for a reason that's never made explicit in the film, they return to the cabin, where the systems of life have begun to fail even further. There's an even further and more elemental breakdown of things. They're reduced to the light of a single lantern, which in itself is not particularly adequate to light the space. And towards the end of the film, at the elapse of the 6th day, you feel very intimately, very bodily, physically, the fading of the light, and the fading of possibility and of hope, until what you're left with is this scene of the man and his daughter at table, you know, with their last meal, and we fade to black. and that is the end. And what I found most beautiful and most humbling about this film, I mean, it's clearly not a film for everybody. It's not going to appeal to the Michael Bay fans in the audience. We know this. But what I found really compelling about the film was its clear premonitory sense. Its very, very clear depiction of a world in which the very most basic systems which we rely upon for our health and well-being, the maintenance of our bodily selves and of our communities and of life itself, have started to sunder and tear apart and break down. And I think it's an appropriate film for a time in which we know that these systems that we've relied upon since time immemorial to be capacious enough to sustain any damage and any amount of insult that we direct at them are in fact starting to respond to our abuse of them. This is the West Antarctic ice sheet, which has started to, as the seas warm and apparently begin to etch against it from underneath, the West Antarctic ice sheet has begun to hive off of the continent itself and fall into the ocean, raising water levels still further, with implications and consequences for our entire planetary ecosystem that I don't think we have fully taken the measure of yet. This is Superstorm Sandy, as it began to develop off of the eastern seaboard of the United States a couple of years back, a storm which met a continental low-pressure front coming in and created a storm that was so large and so violent that the category of hurricane wasn't really adequate to contain it. We had seen, of course, in the United States what hurricanes were able to do to unprepared urban infrastructure. This is New Orleans in the wake of Hurricane Sandy, and it can be debated whether or not the aftermath and the response, excuse me, not Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Katrina. It can certainly be debated whether the response to Katrina could have been handled better had a more competent administration been responsible for that aftermath. But this is the scale of what happens when ecosystems have begun to respond to the human presence on Earth. This is the scale of what happens to a city which is precarious in and of itself and in its rooting upon the Earth. Katrina was not to be the last. This is what happened when Sandy made landfall. It knocked out the power substation on 14th Street in the East River, not so far from where we used to live in Manhattan. And so for the first time that, since I have been an adult, certainly, Manhattan was flooded. I mean, up to your waist. We were not in Manhattan at the time, but we would look on CNN, we would look on television, and we would see a street corner that was flooded up to people's waists, and we would realize, oh my God, that's 34th Street and First Avenue. That's literally the corner that our apartment looks down on. And you can believe or not believe in anthropogenic global warming, but something is clearly happening, something that people are doing to the Earth. We think of oceans, particularly the Pacific Ocean, as being of a scale and of an immensity and of a grandeur, that there's really not that much that we can do to them. But surely, you'll be familiar with stories of the Great Pacific Gyre, which is a maelstrom of plastic and styrofoam and detritus, which is sort of accumulated in mid-ocean. This is not actually from MH370, but when there were when search and rescue planes were sent out to look for MH370, the disappeared Malaysian Airlines flight, when vessels were sent out into the ocean to search those waters for the wreckage of an aircraft, they found way out in the middle of the Pacific, much further out than anybody had expected, just kind of random bleach bottles and six-pack rings floating around out there. It demonstrates, to me at least, the scale of the damage that we've done to the oceans is so profound that we haven't even until this year fully taken the measure of it. And it's not just that our litter is floating around out there, it's that we've changed the chemical composition of the oceans. And so anytime you get these kind of Al Gore talks about, the carbon in the atmosphere and anthropogenic global warming, and what we're really hearing is only half of the story. The salinity of the ocean, the acidity of the ocean, these things, it turns out, are held within very, very delicate balances. They're very delicate thresholds, and once they've begun to be disrupted, the possibility of the entire ocean to maintain life becomes disrupted as well. The ocean becomes much more it becomes an oxygen-free environment. The middle depths of the ocean cannot sustain the life of the food web. And as a matter of fact, the only things that the ocean will maintain at that point become like algal scrums or mats that cover the surface. The environment becomes hostile to the phytoplankton, which are at the very base of the food chain, the food web that the entire earthly ecosystem ultimately depends on. What happens is that when the plankton can't feed, when the creatures that feed on the plankton can't survive, and when the fish that feed on those creatures can't survive, then that entire ecological niche gets cleared out. And what happens is this. There's one kind of creature that does very, very well, and that's jellyfish. We see this kind of thing happening off of the coast of Japan, where the fishing fleets are just encountering that the fisheries have been entirely overrun with, I hope you guys like jellyfish, because we're all going to be eating a lot more of it in the years to come. Jellyfish do quite well in the warm, kind of anoxic waters that we've created in the oceans. So do bacteria, and like I said, so do these kind of fungal algal mats. So that sense of things shutting down that we see in the Turin Horse, it's about something. It's about something that's in the air. It's about something that we have a guilty conscience of, perhaps, but that we've all managed to repress somehow. But, you know, Freud tells us that this funny thing happens when you repress something, which is that it returns. It returns in a different way. It comes back to light in a different form. And, you know, I think of the Turin Horse in its own way as a type of dystopia. And I think that dystopia, you know, has only been increasing in popularity as a genre and as a medium in and of itself over the last couple of years. And we see these images, these astonishing images of sort of an earthly ecosystem which has been depopulated and made impossible for most forms of life. This is from the very bleak film, The Road. You know, the funny thing about these dystopic images, though, is that there's something dishonest about them. I mean, no matter how, you know, real, they present a kind of realism, a kind of brutality that is supposed to be a bona fide of honesty and integrity and commitment to a reality principle, but there's something dishonest about them. And that is this. Dystopia happens every single day. Dystopia happens every day. It just happens to other people. Dystopia happens to people other than us. There is always something brutally dystopic happening on Earth at every moment of every day. It just happens not to be happening to the people who generally sit in air-conditioned cinemas and watch images like this unfold on their screens. And as a matter of fact, as a genre, dystopia has not been able to do very well in terms of elaborating on things which actually happen. It was trivial for me to collect images from some of the better-known dystopic films of the last several years, which, if anything, were less interesting and less dramatic than the real pictures they were based on. So here's an image, an apocalyptic image from Children of Men, Cuarón's film of 2007, of diseased sheep or hooved animals of some sort being burned as military helicopters fly by in the background. It is definitely an image of the end times, or so you'd think, but this is actually from the BBC. This is news footage from 2001, where there was a mass cull of cattle that needed to be burned because of their exposure to bovine spongiform encephalopathy. And these excavators came in and made mountains of beasts that were being culled and set to fire. This is an image from the remake of Total Recall from a couple of years back, where the idea was that, my God, look at this incredible density, this incredible like profusion of life in this grim subterranean existence that people live. Well, you know, all well and good, except it can't steal a match on reality. This is Kowloon Walled City in Hong Kong, which was torn down in 1997. The densities in Kowloon City were the highest ever recorded on Earth. Again, you know, any documentary in Kowloon Walled City, I would have to think, would be infinitely more interesting than this. But this was something that happened, you know, it went on for 50 years. I mean, people lived in these places every single day for 50 years, and they managed to get by. And this is a theme that we'll be coming back to. Here's some images from Elysium from last year, Neil Blomkamp's film. One of the things that you know, is ostensibly kind of futuristic about this is that you see these unfinished skyscrapers, or possibly once finished skyscrapers, have been squatted by people, and this is nominally this kind of futuristic detail imaginative. Well, again, most people who have been following architecture over the last couple of years know that this actually happened in Caracas, Venezuela. There was a high-rise bank building. As a matter of fact, I think the tallest building in Caracas that was never completed due to a financial downturn and was immediately taken over by several thousand organized squatters. The most incredible story of human resilience and survival, you know, very dystopian, very Blade Runner looking, I suppose very Elysium looking. The squatters were ejected from Torre David about 2 weeks ago. But up until that point, you know, had managed to scrape and eke out a living under the most unpromising circumstances, including people who walked every day up 35 flights to their apartment because, you know, my God, it was free, you know. That's given London housing prices, I can definitely see doing that myself. Again, you know, no matter how the filmic imagination suggests that we will live in squalor in the future, again, present reality. Here's an image from Lagos in 2008. Another image from Children of Men. You know, the nominally disturbing image of heavily militarized police in the community, you know, amongst ordinary people, caging them up. Well, this is an image from Rio de Janeiro of the Special Operations Police Battalion, which is their ordinary everyday interaction with the forces of the state. And just a couple of final images from Elysium, this idea that, you know, the wealthy people lived in this sort of circumstance, this gilded enclave above the atmosphere, while everybody else, the more than 99%, were fated to live in housing like this. Again, trivial to find images of where the wealthy live, and in this case, this is Dubai, and this is the housing camp that the guys who built those towers live in. If you want that same idea in a single image, here's an image from Sao Paulo where there's literally, you know, a high-rise condo with every single terrace has its own individual swimming pool right across the street from a favela, and you better believe that is a policed and armed boundary. Even the notion that of Blomkamp's that the servants of the state themselves, you know, would be these sort of emotionally detached sociopathic enforcers of the will of the state upon the body of the unresisting, broken poor. Well, you know, we know where this comes from. These are not dystopian images. These are not science fictional images. These are images, nightmare, funhouse reflections of our own reality. And I find them, I accuse them, and I indict them, and ultimately I convict them of being in bad faith. I believe that all dystopia really means is that we should experience in comfort for a couple of hours the conditions that our way of life forces others to endure. And I believe that that pleasure is an essentially masturbatory frisson. But the deeper truth of dystopia is that it's coming our way. It's our turn. It's our turn now. Now we get to experience what all of that feels like. We get to experience those conditions that we've teased ourselves with. We get to experience what that reality winds up being when it is folded back against our own bodies and our own lives and the lives of those that we love. Well, you know, as I said at the outset, I've worked in technology for a long time, and if there is anything that technology as a discourse and a community of practice believes, it's that everything that I've said up until now is all well and fine and good and dandy, but that certainly and surely technology will save us. And I think that if you review the history of technology, and particularly information technology, over the past several decades, you can see why people think that. I mean, technology has done incredible things, amazing things, but I think it is incumbent upon us, and particularly those of us who work in technology, to ask, what is technology for? And since that's kind of an Enlightenment kind of question, I think it probably deserves an Enlightenment kind of answer. As far as I'm concerned, I believe that technology is ultimately about providing universal access to all human knowledge from wherever in the world you happen to be at any given moment, and whoever in the world you happen to be. And as it happens, this was, or so I would argue to you, this was the vision that animated and justified research and development in information technology from the mid-20th century up until just about 20 minutes ago. This was the vision that inspired a guy named Vannevar Bush, who in an article, an astonishingly prescient article, and if you're not already very familiar with it, I urge you to look it up. It was an article called As We May Think that he published in 1945. And in it, he imagined a tool called the Memex, which was an electromechanical optical information retrieval system that was built into a desk. It had access to all human knowledge in it in microfilm format. And all you would need to do is type in a couple of keywords, and it would retrieve for you the appropriate microfiche. But still more than that, it would allow you to thread these things together in narratives of your own design. It was comprehensively futuristic idea. He came up with all of this himself, and he articulated not merely the engineering details behind it, but also the sort of cultural idea behind it, and what it was for, and what place it would have in the culture. And again, extraordinarily influential with this. Is the sort of flare in the night that lights 1,000 flares on distant hills in response. People read this and in their own ways decided that, this is something that I'd like to contribute to. They decided that I can go off and in my own way, whether it's quite the same thing or not, I can contribute to this vision. Never more profoundly, I would argue, than by a guy named Doug Engelbart, who in 1968 developed, he'd spent the previous several years developing it. He launched it and announced it to the world in a very famous demo in 1968. It was called the Online System, or NLS. What Doug Engelbart brought together, and I think you can probably appreciate how very, very radical all this was. You have to imagine 1968, okay? He had invented the mouse, the graphic user interface, speech recognition, so speech input through the microphone, windowing systems. I mean, basically all of the elements of the interface that I'm still using on this laptop in 2014, Doug Engelbart more or less came up with himself, put together, fabricated, and launched to the world in this astonishing demo that just, we talk so casually now of, oh, it blew my mind, it knocked my socks off, it floored me. The people who were present in that room on that day will never, ever forget it. And they went off and they did things like, they founded Xerox Palo Alto Research Center and eventually, their Xerox Star graphic user interface, which eventually inspired the Apple Macintosh. So much of where we are at right now in terms of our relationship with information technology, the specific tools and metaphors that we use to engage that technology came from the mind of this guy. And it was all because he was driven by the desire to augment the unaided human being, the individual human being. Also the collective human being. This is an important aspect of the story. But for the time being, let's just remember that the idea was to provide access to information from wherever you were and whoever you happened to be, to bring the entire sum of the world's knowledge to bear on any question that you had. By the time we get to the late 1990s, and a lot of these ideas had been commercialized, you could take all of that computing power and you could turn it to essentially non-heroic tasks. This was a guy named Mark Weiser, who was the chief technologist up until the time of his untimely death in 1999, the chief technologist at Palo Alto Research Center. And he basically said, well, given what we've seen with Moore's Law, given what we've seen with the rapidly expanding, astoundingly more powerful computational technologies we now have and their falling prices, we can basically take a Memex or a Doug Engelbart online system and we can put it everywhere. We can put it everywhere around us. We can put information processing and storage and retrieval and representation and communication in the fabric of the built environment at the scale of our bodies, at the scale of our rooms, at the scale of public space. Again, he was driven by the conviction that by so doing it would enable us to work more harmoniously and collaboratively in pursuit of, yes, big problems, But also, already here, we're getting to small problems. Ubiquitous computing, as Weiser had imagined it, was specifically about asking questions like, is that shirt that I saw on sale last week at the department store still on sale? And if I drive downtown, will there be a parking space available for me when I get there? So where computation had been used to do things like model the global environment, to do climate projection, or to model the dynamics at the heart of a nuclear explosion, where computation had been used for profound and heroic things, whether or not you agreed with the morality of them. These were certainly large-scale endeavors. Now information technology has taken this radical turn towards what I might argue is the trivial. And then the trajectory towards democratization that we saw was taken up and brought to fruition and made real in all of our lives. 1993, the World Wide Web, it took a couple of years for it to kind of filter through to mass consciousness and for the costs of internet access or high bandwidth internet access to drop to the point that we're all using the World Wide Web and the internet on a routine basis. By the time you get to 2001, you really do see massive attempts to essentially represent all human knowledge in a way that's available for free to any of us at any time, day or night, from wherever we happen to be. By the time you get to around 2007, 2008, you have the wherewithal and the capability, certainly in principle and in actuality for a great many of us, to take that access and put it in your pocket. By the time you get to where we are now, really, I mean, there are still and there will always be digital divides, profound inequities of access. But the reality is that already at least 30% of all of the adults on the planet have a smartphone in their pockets right now. So anybody who has one of those devices has this, has the sum total of human knowledge available to them on demand. That is a pretty radical accomplishment. It is a fairly major achievement, and it happened in the space of, depending on how you count, between 50 and 60 years by the concerted efforts of a great many people, sometimes operating on their own, sometimes operating collaboratively. But that was a big ambition to solve a huge set of problems. And I would argue that it was relatively successful. But then on the way to utopia, something else happened. Something else happened. This incredible effort that we made collectively as a species to take us to places that we never could have imagined going before was derailed. And it was derailed by things like bullshit IP law, intellectual property law. This is the United States Patent Office drawing, or a drawing that was submitted to the United States Patent Office by Amazon for their, mind you, successful patent of the white background as a feature of an illustration online. The seamless white background is property of Amazon. I mean, seriously, if you take a picture that has a seamless white background on it, if they so choose, they could, file a cease and desist order on you for being in violation of their patent. This is nonsense, and this is bullshit, right? It's pretty clearly bullshit, and yet such is the slippage between the technical sophistication of the people who are empowered to make these decisions and the specificity and the granularity of the decisions that they're increasingly being called on to make, that this is what happens. But also, greed happened. Common or everyday variety greed happened. Walled gardens, instead of really under a principle of openness and sharing of information, increasingly we see that the world is sort of divided up into 5 stacks. And once you're a client of any one of those stacks, the owner of that stack doesn't really particularly want you to play with any of the others. So, are you a devotee of the Google ecosystem or the Facebook ecosystem, the Amazon ecosystem or the Apple ecosystem? Really, these are increasingly being vertically integrated in such a way as that, if this is an image from a couple of years ago, this is an image of an Apple device with a Google map. Well, that, it can still happen. It does still happen. I still use Google Maps on my Apple device, but Apple doesn't want you to do that anymore. They now have their own map, and Google now has their own phone. So, increasingly the idea is that you will be owned by somebody who is going to profit from your every interaction from that surface. And they always say that if, in fact, the service is free, then you are the product. I think this is a reasonable way to understand the deal that we've been offered. We also see technological rent-seeking. This is a guy named Nathan Myhrvold. At one time, he was the number 3 or number 4 at Microsoft. He became very wealthy doing that. He took his wealth. I will not argue that that was ill-gotten wealth, but I will note that it was a Microsoft fortune that he made, and you can draw such conclusions from that as you will. He took that wealth and he invested in a portfolio of patents. Now Nathan, he does have a very interesting sideline called Modernist Cuisine, a very elaborate venture, gorgeously illustrated books. I think they probably in their way do provide value. But he doesn't provide value with his other initiatives and endeavors. What he does is he sits on top of those patents and he seeks to extract rent from them. He seeks to extract licensing fees. He did not design any of the things that are in those patents. He had nothing to do with them. He acquired them, and now he seeks to justify his investment in that by attempting to realize a return on that investment. We've begun to see certainly an accelerating withdrawal of the people who are technologically confident and competent from discourse with the rest of us. Here we see a private Google bus to Mountain View in the Bay Area, replacing the public transit system, which people there will tell you is antiquated and is dirty and has dirty people on it and is too expensive and is broken. And frankly, many of those things are true, but they're true because we don't invest in public infrastructure anymore. They're true because instead of in making the investments in public space and the public sphere that we might, if we believed in a public and in a society, we've decided that the company of people very much like us is more congenial to us, and everybody else can fend and shift for themselves. When you get increased and accelerated withdrawal, you almost arrive at a place where you get cladistics or speciation. You get the world kind of beginning to divide into groups who have very, very little to do with one another, and that the points of interaction between them are fraught with tension. A year or so ago, I did a close reading of Uber's promotional materials, and I found that in every sense, the protagonist of the Uber narrative is a young white man, generally positioned as being in the technology industry. It's not explicitly made clear, but you can tell certain aspects of his deportment, his presentation of self, his facial hair, things of this nature. And then you get the kind of like the Balkan guy who's his servant, who's his quiet and kind of, the subaltern doesn't really have a voice here. You see this sort of accelerated space opening up between these people that will never close again. You see the wealthy and privileged and empowered technological elite retreating into secure enclaves. This is possibly the most futuristic actual environment I've ever been in. This is the Canyon Mall in Istanbul. It looks like a rendering from a Sid Mead matte painting for Blade Runner or something like that. It really does. I mean, and it feels like that to walk through. But the shocking thing, maybe this is less shocking for folks who are from Istanbul. For me and my wife, it was really shocking. There is, as it happens, a public transit station right outside this mall. But as you leave the public transit station, you have to go through a checkpoint to get into the mall. You have to go through a metal detector and a security checkpoint, and it is very, very clearly the case that you will be welcomed into this mall if it is only, if you have the money to spend there. During the entirety of the time that we were there, as a matter of fact, there was no place to sit down. We'd brought sandwiches with us. There was no place to sit down in this mall and simply be and eat a sandwich, which was not part of the sort of designated footage floor area of a commercial establishment. You could not simply be there if you weren't generating revenue for somebody. We tried to sit down on one of these like kind of low walls down here and just eat our sandwiches, and it was so uncomfortable that we had to get up and leave. I mean, it was really, you remember that scene in Inception where like the militarized subconscious is trying to kind of push out the invaders? It felt like that. It was the closest analog to that I hope ever to experience. So, I think pretty clearly, I would argue now that information technology, where previously it had if yes, a universalizing, if yes, a particularly kind of Western Enlightenment, white bread notion of progress, but at least it did have this utopian value set associated with it. And I think, defensibly so in many ways, this project associated with it, which had a certain moral grandeur to it. Absolutely had problems, deserved to be critiqued, deserved to have its feet held to the fire, but let's face it, at least had some kind of justificatory apparatus associated with it that is worth arguing about. And now I think I'm certainly prepared to argue the point with people. I understand this is not going to be universally held opinion, but I think that information technology, as we now understand it, has become more or less the handmaiden of capital. And its job is to create the sorts of non-innovation innovations which will wind up being readily investable intellectual property and generate revenue and generate return on investment for venture capital firms. And if, in fact, information technology has become the handmaiden of capital, then we can see pretty clearly what the outline of the handmaiden's tale looks like. Technology, information technology, is always already entangled with the circumstances on Earth which lead to its creation. These utopian devices that we have in our pockets, they are always associated with a factual history of despoilation of the planet, the mining for the rare earth minerals that goes to make up those devices, the mining for the metals that wind up giving these things the power to be what they are. It has an impact on Earth. We wind up becoming entangled in a history of exploitation of people who live lives that are, by our standards, are again rather dystopian. I do not think it's too much to say that here we see the revolution betrayed. We see devices like this created, which are nothing but engines to impose invidious distinctions between us, interfaces that wind up cutting us off from people and those around us, the experiences in our lives. We have cheerleaders for technology like Kevin Kelly, arguing that you are not too late, that it's still not too late. If you think that the history of innovation is over, jump on in now. There's plenty of time to do Uber for grocery shopping, or Uber for gated communities, or Uber for whatever you want. This, mind you, is the same man who tried to sell us in about 1997 the notion that the new economy required fundamentally new rules, and that the future would be one of boundless growth. He was one of those kind of Dow 40,000 people. Kevin Kelly, I believe in his heart, is absolutely, sincerely, legitimately an optimist, but what he is not wrapping his head around is that our story is one of diminishing marginal innovation, where instead of inventing things which attach us to that wonderful history of attempting to liberate humanity from the bounds of ignorance and a lack of knowledge, are now devices of howling fatuity. Here is, well, I don't even need to say any more about this individual and his cheerleading for dead-end technologies. At best, the things we do now are in the nature of adolescent wish fulfillment fantasies, and particularly male adolescent wish fulfillment fantasies. Fantasies of unlimited strength. Here is a Lockheed Martin exoskeleton for the United States military. Fantasies of control over our own rebellious bodies. The idea that we could bring these envelopes of flesh back under algorithmic, computational, repeatable, predictable control. Fantasies of escape from the gravity well of Earth and to the possibility that we could implant our destiny on the soil of other planets. This is a colony from Mars, designed by a company called Mars One, a commercial privatized space access enterprise. Even fantasies of transcendence, transcending matter entirely, not merely the unruly facts of our own bodies, but the difficult facts of the physical universe. The idea that we can somehow magic our way to a technological transcendence, a moment of singularity at which we become essentially gods and aspire, each and every one of us individually, to be bodily and psychically uploaded into an eternal galaxy-spanning evernet from which we never need die. This is, there's a guy named Ray Kurzweil, and he sells books, many, many, many books. He sells a lot of books, and they have titles like The Singularity is Near. Ray lost his father to cancer at a fairly young age, and it's obvious to me, that is a moment of great sorrow. It's a moment of heartbreak. I don't take that away from anybody. I can't even imagine the pain that's involved in that. But instead of reckoning with that pain, Ray wants to do an end run around it. He wants all of us to upload our minds, and never have to confront the reality of death ever again. And I think that's a perverse ambition. I think that is an astonishingly shallow thing to want from technology. So, I don't necessarily believe that technology is going to save us from ourselves. There's another answer, though. There's another group of people who have a kind of optimism. They say, well, if technology in itself won't save us, certainly growth will save us. A rising tide will lift all boats. Prosperity and growth, that these are the engines of human liberation, and that technology is sort of, it's a ship that is rising on this tide along with everything else, but really what we need to do is unlock the boundless potential of human creativity that is at the root of growth in the economy. And if we unlock that engine, then all bets are off and all is well. Well, as Thomas Piketty has demonstrated for us, he has this very famous idea that there is a ratchet in the economy. It only turns one way. His formula is R is greater than G, and what that means is that the rate of return on private investments is greater than the growth of the economy. If this is the case, and it has been the case for quite a long time now, if the rate of return on investment is greater than the growth in the economy, then more and more wealth winds up getting accumulated in fewer and fewer hands. Without regulation, without the government stepping in to redistribute and reallocate that wealth, we will wind up ultimately approaching, as a matter of fact, there's a kind of a network. There's a network topology called winner take all, where one party may literally own everything. We are approaching that in the design and structuration of our economy. More and more and more and more of us are reduced to lives of precarity. We may be materially comfortable, but in every register that really matters, our lives are precarious. We're shit scared most of the time. Everything is balanced on a knife edge, where very, very, very few people own all of the wealth in the world. And even if that doesn't bother you, even if you're okay with all of that, there's another problem with growth and this sort of mystification, this idea of limitless and unlimited and eternal growth. There's only one thing on earth that grows without limit. Does anybody know what this is? That's cancer, right? Nothing in the universe grows without limit. Everything is cyclical. Everything rises and subsides. Death, it turns out, is a critical part of that. Death is a critical part of the cycle of life. Death is a critical part of renewal. I think if we try to do an end run around death, I think if we try to avoid downturn, cessation, subsidence, collapse, if we try to avoid these things, not only is it sort of adolescent, but it's ultimately futile. These things are part of the rhythm of every system that we understand and know about. So if there will be no rescue via growth, this is a collapse of a interstate bridge in Minneapolis a couple of years ago. The economy can grow nominally. It can make people wealthy, but if we're not investing in each other, in the basic systems that undergird everyday life, then this is what happens. So there will be no rescue via growth in and of itself. We can have growth, but we need to have other mechanisms in place as well. There will be no escape. These are, as far as I'm concerned, the saddest 3 words in the English language. Does anybody recognize what this is at all in the background? No. This is Launch Complex 39A at Cape Canaveral, what used to be called Cape Kennedy. It's where the moon shots went up from. That infrastructure was abandoned. We decided to turn our back on that ambition. All of that knowledge, everything that was bound up in it, we just didn't perceive any value from it. My friend Nicholas de Monchaux would argue that this was never about human knowledge, was never about the great adventure. He said the whole point of the space program was not merely to put somebody on the moon, not even merely to put an American on the moon, but to capture video images of an American on the moon that could be put up against the world media at that time. And once that was achieved, there was no further point in doing any of this. It's a very cynical argument, but I find it very hard to argue with because that is what happened. We turned our back on this. So if there will be no escape from this cradle of humanity, there will be no rescue via growth, my goodness, neither will there be any transcendence. We can't escape ourselves. We can't escape our primate nature in a lot of ways. This is what we do with tools. This is Trinity Site, where Robert Oppenheimer, after having detonated the first atomic bomb in 1945, famously said, I am become death, destroyer of worlds. This is part of who we are too. So these are things that we need to reckon with if we are to discover any optimism at all. And if there's any enemy of optimism, it isn't pessimism. No, it's hope. I would argue to you that we must kill hope if we're to discover optimism. And we've got to anchor our optimism in the real. Because billions of people on this planet right now live every day of their lives with a horizon around their ambitions. A real horizon. Very, very concrete horizon. I mean, so far are they from imagining with Ray Kurzweil that they can upload their consciousness to an eternal galaxy-spanning Evernet. They are struggling to get things like clean water or a place to shit safely. And if they can do that, well, we can learn to as well. There are, in fact, very useful things that we can be doing with technology. Very, very useful practices and habits. Profoundly meaningful, profoundly restorative, profoundly value-generating and worth-giving things. Things like adaptive reuse of the technologies we see. I'm going to show you a couple of images now, which, these images generally circulate on joke sites on the internet, on sites which share memes, which are like, ha ha ha, isn't that funny? Look at those poor backward people in India or rural China. Look at the crazy things they do with this. Here, using an old moped to turn a mill or a well pump. Things like improvisation. Again, this is like presented to us as a figure of fun instead of a figure of astonishing ingenuity. Things like repair, so a culture of adaptive reuse of the technologies around us, and improvisation, using the things which are made that constitute the built and the fabricated environment, and repair. I mean, anywhere in China, and increasingly this is sort of a looked down upon activity, right? The thing that has the grandeur in China now is to buy the name brand, the flashy thing. It's a peasant thing. It's déclassé, literally déclassé, to ever want to repair anything. You remember in Brave New World, the hypnopedic instruction that all the kids were given, every hour of the night as they slept? Ending is better than mending. Ending is better than mending. I mean, that's basically what people now believe, not merely in China, here as well. We've lost the sense that the things of the material world have value in them and can have that value restored with a process of repair. We don't have the tools, we don't have the skills, we don't have the habits, but they can be recovered. We've been here before, as a matter of fact. We've learned, this is a really incredibly crappy and low resolution image, but I find it fascinating. It's a man during the Depression using a car as an ox cart. He's basically disengaged the transmission of the car and he's using it as a cart because that's fucking brilliant. And because he didn't have the gas to operate the car, but needed a cart, and found that locomotion was available via other means. If only he was able to turn his ingenuity to these things. Yeah, we've been here before, so maybe, just maybe, we ought to stop thinking about tomorrow and instead affirm this moment on Earth and the potentials it offers to us. The potentials are extraordinary, and they fill me, personally, with all of the optimism that I'll ever need and then some. I become actually, when speaking about these next several subjects, I become one of those really annoying American people who's just jumping up and down and thinks that all this stuff is peachy keen and grand, because it is. It's pretty great. We start with compassion. We start with understanding that the modern world has inflicted really uncomfortable and difficult circumstances on a great many people. And though we may not personally share those experiences right now just yet, we can certainly understand that discomfort and precarity and fear are things which will come to us all at some point. And if we can develop the empathy within us to act on behalf of other people, I think we can find chambers in our own heart and our own possibility that we hadn't suspected were there previously. It gives rise to a feeling of the most intense solidarity, that we can come together, even at this late stage in our cultural history, even when the idea of collective action has been corroded and abraded and eroded for 30 or 40 years of purposive action on both sides of the Atlantic by the inheritors of President Reagan and Mrs. Thatcher. We can come together to raise our voices, to demand change, to celebrate, to build things together. We can help each other. This is an image of volunteers in Occupy Sandy, which I had the very great fortune to be involved with, albeit very humbly. Occupy Sandy was a movement that came out of this. This is, of course, Occupy Wall Street. Occupy Wall Street set up the conditions, set up in a very material way the networks, the material networks and the social networks that allowed Occupy Sandy to stand up in the immediate aftermath of the storm we had seen before. And what Occupy Sandy did was extraordinary. There's something in the United States called the Federal Emergency Management Administration. It is the government's agency that's responsible for addressing mass casualty situations, mass disruptions in the event of natural disasters, terrorism, that sort of thing. So they train and prepare and are budgeted and have a whole doctrine that's about nothing but responding to things like Sandy. There's the American Red Cross. Similarly, they train and they think about this constantly. In the aftermath of Sandy, neither FEMA nor the American Red Cross was able to effectively get aid out to the hardest hit communities. What did was a non-hierarchical, leaderless, horizontal organization of people who were completely untrained in any of the disciplines that they required. They learned as they went. They made it up as they went along. The only doctrine that informed their action was that of anti-imperialist, anti-oppressive, non-hierarchical, horizontal, leaderless organization. It was astonishingly effective in some really hard-knuckled ways, to the point that, like, PricewaterhouseCoopers would send analysts to the Occupy Sandy distribution hubs to study how people made this up as they went along. How did they discover how to do a disaster relief hub from nothing in a way that was more effective than anybody else could do? It relied on human relations. It relied on shared values to some degree, but ultimately it relied on the principles of mutual aid and of meaningful effort. This is a picture of something which has been incredibly encouraging and inspiring to me recently. In Detroit recently, a couple of 100,000 households had their water shut off due to non-payment of their water bills. It's pretty well established that access to drinking water is a human right under the United Nations Charter. It's pretty, it can be argued certainly that those people were in arrears and they should be compelled to pay their bills, but it doesn't mean you go around shutting their water off. A group called Detroit Water Brigade, which was Occupy veterans, came together and began to develop bottom-up infrastructure for the distribution of water in a major western city of a developed economy. It's not glamorous. It's certainly not, going to get you the same kind of attention as putting a computer on your face. But I would argue that ultimately it is a far more resonant and rewarding effort. I will tell you that the brief amount of time I spent in, essentially bucket brigades during Occupy Sandy, where nobody knew who the hell I was, nobody cared who the hell I was, nobody would have cared who the hell I was. All they cared about was that I was a set of hands that was capable of moving boxes from one place to another. Those are the most rewarding couple of days of my life. Far more resonant, far more meaningful to me than just about anything I've ever done. So these things, they're there for us if we wish to discover them. It means that we need to reckon with the idea, unlike my friend Jane, you know, she would say reality is broken and we can fix it with technology. No, reality is not broken. Reality doesn't require augmentation. Reality is difficult. Reality is messy. Reality hurts. And at times hurts very, very badly. But it will never lie to you, and it cannot cheat you. So if I have one request for you, it is that we should all be real now. And when we wind up here, as I believe we all will in one way or another, we're prepared for that moment. And we're ready to meet it with grace and dignity and integrity. We are all we will ever have. And as we confront what we've done to this planet and what it means for all of us, if we understand this, and we own it, and we live it, it will allow us to move into the twilight, undeceived, unafraid, with eyes open, together. Take care of each other, and thank you very much for your time and attention. Questions?
Can we join your church? So shall I talk through the microphone? I'm just going to walk around and ask people to ask questions.
You get to be the Oprah now, man.
I'm just, you know, but this is for the internet.
Oh, jeez. So you, I love your talk. Thank you. It's very much.
Cheers.
Very good.
Could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, say your name, man. Tell me who you are.
Okay, yeah. My name's Sam Hewitt. I live and work in Brighton. You talked about the greed habit that we're all kind of subscribe to it in bigger or smaller ways. It seems to me that it's about snapping out of that. And, you know, it's experiences like Sandy that snap people out of it. How do we do that without those things happening? How do we snap out of it?
Oh, it's a great question. How do we snap out of it? Well, somebody taught me in college, and I'm going to forget which great bearded Greek philosopher is supposed to have said this, but I remember writing it in my little notebook with the minor threat and black flag stickers on it, so it must have been important. It said, virtue is a process. And, you know, virtue isn't just one thing that we do. It's a habit that we enact on a daily basis. How do you snap out of it? You do it once, and then you do it twice, and maybe you do it 3 times. I mean, so last year, the entire calendar year, I'm really into, you know, gestures, but also round numbers. So I said for all of 2013, it's going to be buy nothing 2013. You know, that consumerism, I thought, was really kind of this corrosive force, not merely in society, but in my life, and that I wanted to step off that train. So, you know, we drew up a set of household rules that in essence said, yeah, we can pay for groceries and toilet paper, and, you know, we're not going to be draconian about this. I mean, I like books, so, you know, I'm allowed to buy books, right? But clothing, no, right? And gadgets, no. And household accessories, no. And, you know, if something breaks and you have a meaningful need for it, then you can, you know, take steps to address that need. But otherwise, you're just not going to participate in the economy on that level. And do you know what I found was that it was incredibly easy to do that. Once I had established a rhythm, it was almost, you know, I'm not going to say it was a game because I don't believe in gamification, but it was fun. It was like, you know, I would say like, oh, you know, on March 1st, I was like, okay, we're into month 3 of Buy Nothing 2013. The more momentum that built up behind that, the easier it was to do. I would imagine that if other people had been inspired to join, it would have been easier yet. You know, we know from our studies of epidemiology and network dynamics that the things that the people around you do, you know, are great influences on you and you on them, right? It's easier to be fit if everybody around you is fit. It's much easier to go back to a habit like smoking or eating junk food if everybody around you does that. If we can not merely make it a habit of our own selves, but of the people around us, then we can enact that process. Now, what happened when I moved here at the beginning of 2014 was that I said, okay, you know, great experiment in virtue, and you know, it's been fun, I've learned a lot, and now I'm going to go back to, you know, allowing myself to buy stuff. And I lost control again. You know, I just, you have to kind of enact these things, you know, with purpose and seriousness, or at least I do. You know, at least I do. It's always been very much more easy for me personally to either be a vegetarian or, you know, an enormous carnivore, but not necessarily modulate. That is what has worked for me, is drawing bright, clear lines and trying to stay every day of my life on one side of that line. Once you draw those lines, things get easy. And you try to build these systems into your life, and what I found is that you at least increase the chances of noticing when other people are doing that as well, and valuing that.
Maybe you find something that works, and you go, hey, this works.
Very important. Very important that we share success stories of that nature. Yeah. I hope that's a reasonable answer.
There was one person here. I have this quite modern microphone here in my hand. There was one person online updating this really well. That was Justin Picard right here in front. What was your experience of this talk? And
you're putting him on the spot, man.
Well, we have brilliant people in the audience as well. It's nice to have the conversation and see, because you're doing you're writing your PhD thesis right now. You're going to India. How did you experience this talk, and how do you connect to this?
This is a bit of a weird one, but I saw you speak, actually, Adam, in conversation with Usman Haq in 2009, like way back.
Yeah.
And that was a bit of an intense kind of back and forth that kind of, I don't know, knocked my head off in a slightly different direction, maybe. But there was a point of that kind of clear-sighted view of climate change then, and that was a little while back.
5 years ago.
That was kind of startling, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know, I'm just kind of, because there's something about the dystopic stuff where it feels like, is that not a necessary kind of cultural level response, right? Whether or not it is kind of like a kind of knee-jerk reaction to, or a return of some of the stuff that we're trying to bundle out elsewhere. Is it not getting people into a headspace where they're kind of feeling comfortable, not necessarily feeling comfortable, but like encountering that kind of mode of things, even if it is vicariously and something that can be plugged into and plugged out of? Is it something that is necessarily negative? I guess that would be my main question.
I don't know. I have two ways of answering that. I think it's a great question. The first way is sort of my knee-jerk response, is to say that no, it's so bracketed, you know, that people think they can walk out of the theater and they've left it on the screen. You know, that was something that happens in this very buffered space of the cultural imaginary. And that is a space of alterity. It's a space of otherness. It's a heterotopia. And it's something that, you know, we use theaters for that. I mean, I think that's sort of, in a way, it's almost disrespectful to the history of theater, you know, and using that as a medium to confront the issues which do arise in our lives. But, you know, I worry that if we position this stuff as escapist entertainment, yeah, then that is one possible outcome from that. Another answer is to say that, you know, there's preppers in the States. I don't know, do you guys know what preppers are? Doomsday preppers? Yeah. I mean, you know, these are people who see zombie films, and then they say, okay, I'm going to go and put I'm going to put 6 months of bottled water and canned food in my basement against the zombie apocalypse. Yeah, survivalists. You know, and that's not the kind of engagement with the end of the world that I mean, right? I mean, that stuff is always so clearly to me about race and about exclusion and about some really creepy values that, yeah, you know, is that a way of engaging, you know, with the reality of, but even that is this kind of, it's a video game projection where you get to shoot down the bad guys. It's almost always about the application of kinetic force to the body of the other and not really about what human communities have done throughout history to actually survive under actual really crappy circumstances, which has come together. You know, yeah, you know, have there been heads on pikes at the city gates? Yes, there have been. I'm not overlooking that. But the history of human adaptation to difficult circumstances is at least as much about collaboration and about collective cooperative action as it is about the lone sentry, you know, silhouetted against the sunset with, you know, the M16, you know, with the glowing eyes of the zombie hordes on the horizon, you know. And I think that even these dystopias are not doing a very good job of telling that story. If they did, maybe there would be, you know, maybe that's a really interesting trajectory, right? Like the first dystopia that's actually about collective action and response. Sorry, it's not a very well thought out answer.
Where you're taking this, Adam? You've been writing a book.
Yeah.
And you've published like a prequel to that recently.
Yeah.
And you've just signed a contract or a deal with Verso.
Yeah.
One of probably many people's favorite labels of philosophy. Congratulations for that. You started your book, was titled Against the Smart City. The city's... I have that extra brain here, that's really good. The city is here for you to use against the smart city, or a manifesto against the smart city, or a pamphlet, or...
Yeah.
Is that changing now? Because this, having been following your line of talking, it's always been, and you have to excuse me for my English, and I would be able to say this in Dutch much more elegantly, but kind of hardcore, straightforward, giving us the message.
You're really asking if I'm becoming a fucking hippie.
No, not at all.
Okay.
So I'm used to your tone, I'm used to your language, but you're drifting away from urbanism and from kind of the built environment and thinking. No. So you're not?
No.
So my question would be, is this going to be your book, and have you changed it? Have you changed your...
No. If this shows up at all in the book, it will be in the very, very last bits of it, you know, kind of explaining everything that's come before. I don't think that this is really necessary. This is almost, this talk, you'll forgive me, right? This talk is a talk for me more than anything else. I hope you forgive me for that. This is basically like setting forth the grounds on which we can now create. This is an astonishingly liberating thing to go through when you accept all this and you say, okay, this is what's bearing down on us, and it's ugly, and it may not end well personally, right? You know, we all have skin in the game. But, you know, wow, killing hope is an incredible, it's incredible, release of power and energy. Because once you don't have hope anymore, then you can act. And I think that the book is about systems of collaboration. And it is anchored in empirical case studies. It's about cities and about what cities are for and how we use them, and ultimately what they do for us. And it is absolutely, you know, it is the one speculative or anticipatory thing about that book is that it's trying to connect the dots between a couple of real world things that, you know, folks may or may not be aware of each other. They may not see the trajectory or the narrative that connects them, and I'm trying to articulate that narrative.
So what's the alternative for hope? So what's the self-controlled version of it? Because kind of hope is waiting for someone else to...
Yeah.
So what is that?
Doing stuff, making things happen, building.
Where does love come in for you?
Yeah, I think that there's...
That's a serious question.
Yeah, why did you laugh?
I was saying where does failure come in?
No, I'm interested in the subject because I made an exhibition called Dread, which deals exactly with these subjects as well, and that was based on kind of the after 9/11 world where we're being bombarded by information from governments and media and corporations saying that accidents and attacks and terrorism can happen. So buy this, do that, don't do this, and vote for us. And Dread is closely related to hope because it's kind of coming. It's it's in the just after the now, and it might happen, and hope is about that as well. And kind of talking with people about, so what's the antithesis of that then, or what's the cure for dread, and kind of faith or love or not caring, ignorance as well, kind of, or being stupid or inanimate. But
those are all great responses. But
yeah,
you know,
but
my argument. Look here, I have this sort of article of faith. I do have an article of faith, right? My article of faith is that it always ends in a quarry at 2 o'clock in the morning with a shot in the back of the head. You know, like you've been dragged out of your bed. You know, your house has been broken into by the security police, and they drag you away by the scruff of your neck, blindfolded, and they put you in a truck, and they take you to a quarry, and they put you on the edge of the quarry, and they shoot you in the back of the neck, and your body falls into the quarry, and there you lie for the end of time, right? That's how it always ends. It's you know, this is where we're going, right? If you this is room 101, right? This is my room 101 maybe, and once you own that, well, then you're so free to do what, and you're free to enact love as you interpret it. Is that perverse? Maybe.
I'm not here to give opinions. I'm here to understand perspectives. Is there another perspective in the audience? Perhaps is there anybody with another question? I think it's Georgina here. Yeah, I'm sorry. We're doing this for our YouTube channel.
This is a quick one, I guess. Just thinking back through the conditions you were laying out, so the way you were explicating it, I was curious about whether there was a direct invocation or analogy with principles around mindfulness that you were advocating, around rather than shielding and hiding and running around pain, leaning into it and feeling it, not necessarily feeling having emotion associated with it, but experiencing it bodily, being aware that the only moment is this moment now, and being very aware of the capacity that one has materially and corporeally, rather than trying to get around it in any other way. It's just you, and you're there on a mat.
Yes.
Yes?
Yes. No, I mean, you caught me out, right? You caught me. I spent 18 years doing Buddhist meditation every single day of my life, without a single exception across those 18 years, until about 2 years ago. And so I would be very surprised, very, very surprised, if that doesn't inform and show up in everything that I do and say and produce in this world. Why did I give it up? Because ultimately I thought that it was sort of an empty gesture. You know, it was almost a hygienic thing, or a way of saying, it was almost exculpatory in a way. It was like it had become the thing that it was designed to circumvent itself. But yeah, sure, absolutely, all of that. It's in there. So
Okay.
yeah, very, very clearly spotted.
Okay.
Since it's here.
Yes.
It's really interesting that you clearly brought up Minor Threat and Black Flag,
Yeah.
and Articles of Faith. That was that whole scene, especially early 80s DIY scene, I always took as being, had a lot of kind of like utopian elements about it, about people taking themselves, you know, witnessing a system that was existing around them, taking themselves out of it, attempting to make something new.
Yeah.
But as you're probably aware, and I feel like I'm really aware, what came out of that was those people got out of it when they realized what was being created off of the back of this idea, and it just became 99.9% of this self-referential detritus that doesn't need to exist, and still, you know, 0.1% of really good stuff happening, but majority of those ideas were totally lost in that. And there seems to me to be a long history in recorded history as it's presented to us now, of masses of people over and over again being more comfortable with static systems, things that don't really change, things that allow for individual comfort and that aren't challenging. There was this really great quote, again, this is a quote that we get over here from there, which is obviously very problematic in itself, but somebody who is in the newly annexed Crimea saying this is great because in Russia the government never changes. It's great, you know. So you don't get all this coming and going and this instability and this unknowingness of what's going to come next, because they always have the same government, which obviously from how it's fed to us, that's a really like abhorrent thing. They always have that same government. But so in these, the examples that you've given about kind of small-scale changes and things like the Occupy movement, which is still going, but seems to be showing real signs of collapse in some areas of it, at least at the moment. Is there much history to suggest this is a viable process, and that basically a lot, more than just kind of a very small percentage of people are going to really want to push this and really make this happen?
Yeah, no, I think it's a super important question, and if I can paraphrase it, because I think it is exactly the right question. Isn't it kind of narcissistic to think that the things which jazz me, and personally make me feel like I'm living a real life, isn't it sort of narcissistic and arrogant of me to project that on systems when, as you say, most people most of the time want to be left alone to get on, and don't want to actively be enacting the revolution in everything they do at all times. I think that is a very, very real concern. It is a correct concern. It's a proper concern. I'm less interested in Occupy qua Occupy. I'm interested in systems of radically democratic decision-making on a day-to-day basis. And the question is, do people really want to do that, or do they not? And I think what we can see is that there are places on Earth, some really unlikely places like Porto Alegre in Brazil, where participatory budgeting has become so much of the order of the day that participatory government of the place, there is a practice of doing this, which has been, it started out as sort of the theoretical love child of maybe, the Ian Mackay or the Henry Rollins of Brazil. But it has become simply the way things are done. And tens of thousands of people participate in this process. Hundreds of thousands of people participate in this process. It has caused them to make demands of the other institutions around them and the other systems that really condition their lives. So yeah, it is exhausting to kind of constantly be doing everything yourself. It is exhausting to constantly be reinventing the systems around us. But I think the good news is that there are structures and processes that are more regularizable, that are finer gauged to the exigencies of everyday life, that can be dealt with on a day-to-day basis by people who are not interested in flags of any color, who are not interested in martyring themselves to a political principle, but just want quality of life, bourgeois quality of life. But what they've discovered is that this is the way, this is the surest and swiftest way towards what they understand as quality of life. And oh, by the way, they become active participants in creating the thing that orders their life. That gives me great hope. I think that the theater of Occupy may have been effective. It may have turned off just as many people as it engaged. I don't know. But the reality of it was that people got a taste, particularly during Sandy, for the practicalities of horizontal, leaderless organization, self-organized systems working in ways that were efficient even by the criteria of hierarchical order. And I have to believe that those people found that a valuable experience. So just, the industrial workers of the world used to talk about creating the new society within the shell of the old. They used to talk about creating ever-enlarging spaces in which we could be free to be ourselves and be whole and complete human beings. And I guess that's what I'm interested in, is like, as the world begins to close in around us, why don't we enact as a counter-principle the idea that we're just going to spend more and more of our lives directly engaged with one another, emotionally present to one another, doing things which really matter, not because of the ideological purity of it, but because it leads us to better experiences and, yes, even a better, even under bourgeois definitions, quality of life. And I think that that's a defensible idea. I think that there's some empirical support for that idea.
I think we have time for 2 questions, and then I'll bring you to the bar. There's one here first.
Thank you. Why are you talking to this?
Yeah, where is it?
Oh.
Somewhere.
Is it here? Sorry, technology.
internet. So following on maybe from this gentleman's question on, my question was more about social media, and is it a hindrance, or is it, you know, what is its limits and its strong points?
Yeah.
I grew up in Italy, and when I was 14, we occupied our school. So we had kind of an enactment of social, of political importance. How can we use, how can the pupils in a school use their political force and negotiate with police, for example? Social media seems to be good. You talked about the Arab uprising, Arab Spring, but at the same time it tends to isolate. It's kind of got this duplicity, which is quite tricky. And I was wondering if you could talk about social media and how it's a force for good, but also tends to isolate, maybe. I don't know. This is...
Well, you know, it's funny. In my writing about technology, I generally insist on being very granular and very specific. So I don't talk about things like, you know, social media. I would tend to talk about a specific thing, like, you know, we can talk about Twitter, or we can talk about Facebook, or we can talk about Instagram. The model of technology that I generally use is, it's neither strictly, well, it's clearly not techno-determinist, but it's also not strictly social constructionist. It's that each technology specifically has certain affordances and certain constraints. It has certain ways that it makes us easier. You know, there are things that it makes easier to do, and there are things that it makes more difficult to do. Each one of those distinct social media might have a different spread of characteristics and capabilities, which might lend itself to promotion but not intimacy, or, you know, to the creation of affective bonds but not the exchange of information.
Aren't they tied together? You know, to create a community, to create environments where you're mindful and you live together, you need these two together.
Yeah, absolutely do.
Separating them kind of leaves you a bit confused all the time.
It can be, which is why I've tended to believe that a multi-channel communicate, you know, you'll forgive me for using the jargon, a multi-channel communication strategy is ultimately, you know, you have to use, I mean, if I were to promote an event or to want to catalyze interest in something, I would use Twitter because it's great at amplifying messages. But I would also, you know, seek to appeal to the traditional media because they're great at telling longer form stories. But I would also want to be on the ground and you know, physically meeting as many people as possible. And what you do is you play the strengths and the weaknesses of each medium off against each other until you have a reasonably full armamentarium and ways to address the specific limitations of each. And if it sounds like I have a theory behind this, the theory broadly is United States military psychological operations doctrine, which I was trained in as a psychological operations sergeant. So that's, you know, when the United States military goes about trying to change hearts and minds, that's how it does it. You know, posters and broadcasts and interviews with influential people and people on the ground explaining things and handing out leaflets. You have to do all of that because that's the only way that it addresses the inherent limitations of certain tools. But I mean, you know, the other thing I would say is that if you're occupying schools when you're 14, you don't have anything to learn from anybody else, and you ought to be teaching the rest of the people in the world how you did that. And I would love to find out more about that because that's awesome and inspiring.
There was one, oh sorry. There was one more question in the middle.
One of them just as a microphone. All right, I'm going to speak into the pile of it. It sounds as if you had a significant life-changing moment during Occupy Sandy, in the sense that it brought you to this state of addressing the world. Are you suggesting that the programmers in Mountain View need to have a Sandy moment for them to wake up? Or the guys sitting at Goldman Sachs trading futures on rising prices in Asia, do they need to be neck deep in water for them to actually wake up? Because otherwise the disparity of capital is not being addressed in what you've talked about.
Yeah. If you drew that conclusion from what I'm arguing, you wouldn't be wrong. With the proviso that a shock to the system, you know, we each have enormous amounts of degrees of freedom in how we respond to a shock to the system. And it's entirely possible that if you're primed and conditioned with the belief of, divine right, that when that shock occurs, instead of having the reaction that I had, which was to say, wow, this takes me away from my ego and my identity, and that feels much better than my ego and my identity do on a day-to-day basis. It's entirely possible people would react differently. I mean, look at Ray Kurzweil, right? Like, he had this shock to the system. He lost his father. My response to that might be to be extra attentive to everybody around me, for signs that they were dealing with a loss like that. His reaction to that was, maybe we can design death out of the human experience. So yeah, would I suggest that kind of reckoning with some fairly unpleasant realities would be salubrious for those individuals and personally productive? Yeah, I believe it would be, but I think there's always the chance that it would merely harden them in their resolve to be bastards, and maybe even worse bastards than they are now. We'll never know. I think that one way or another, though, they are going to get that experience. And so part of what I'm arguing is that we need to imagine what it's like when people who have had everything handed to them on a silver platter all their lives suddenly face the prospect of that platter's withdrawal. How do they react? Do they become, instant communitarians, or do they try to fight over the scraps of what's left? I don't know.
So you're saying bring on the apocalypse, basically?
I mean,
I'm with you on that one. Bring it on, but.
Yeah, and I don't think that, I'll put it this way, I think that we've passed the inflection point.
So do you see peak oil being the one that's going to hit America first?
Peak oil? I think peak oil happened.
In terms of actually the impact on infrastructure of the States, which is.
What happened is pretty much precisely what the peak oil catastrophists argued was going to happen, which is that we've been ever more desperate in seeking out things like fracking, right? And fracking has sort of extended the curve of the available resources, but only at the cost of incredible damage to the shared environment. What we're going to do is spend ever more effort trying to extract jewels from tar sands, without regard to the lives that are lived on the land that's affected by that. I think the peak oil catastrophists, they stole a march from the rest of us. They kind of saw it coming. I don't really like much of the literature that's associated with that movement. As a matter of fact, I find James Howard Kunstler to be unbearable, intolerable, actually, and a kind of a secret racist, a secret gleeful racist. But I don't think they were incorrect, no. I think that they saw further and more clearly than most of us. They taught me a thing or two.
May I thank you, Alan Greenfield?
Sure, thanks.